Nope, not a real pocket.
I knew you were. Just bear with us about 2 more minutes. So how's everything in the Lone Star State?
It's great. Great, and we've been enjoying, we went to see Wicked, and our son's in Wicked in Springfield. It just happens to be.
My host family went last night. Yeah. Well, you know Chuck and Carol Cooksey.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah. They were there last night.
Tonight should be better because he's the wizard tonight.
Okay. Hey, you might as well.
Yeah. We've lost track of how many times we've seen him. He's been in it 14 years.
Excellent. So we can start? Okay. Folks, thank you so much for coming out today. We have a slight change, actually a major change in the program. What happened was our special guest for today, Nancy Finley, and you would remember her family. Her dad and her uncle owned the Oakland A's, which were previously the Kansas City A's. And what happened, Nancy's husband, a couple of months ago, suffered a stroke. And he's had some debilitating problems. And he's been in and out of the hospital in Georgetown, Texas. And he was just released a couple of days ago, but Nancy is unable to be with us today, but she'll be here next year. So in her stead, Nicholas said, why don't you give a program on your baseball career? Now, I know that most of you out there are going to be Cardinal fans, right? Okay, so please don't throw any baseballs at me or anything, but I was a scout for the Chicago Cubs. So we're gonna talk a little bit about that today, and how this guy who never played professional baseball ended up becoming a scout for the Cubs. And I think you'll enjoy it. Well, let's go ahead and start. I grew up as a Cub fan, like most kids in Northwest Illinois, and my mom and dad were baseball fans too. We came from a mixed marriage, though. My mom was a diehard Cardinal fan from the time she was a kid, and always had the transistor radio glued at night listening to Harry Carey and Jack Buck. And my dad, and Mary's remembering that tandem too. What a great announcing team that was, Mary. And my dad, had grown up being a Cub fan, and from the time that he was a little boy, his dad, my granddad, used to take him to Wrigley Field, and Dad talks about the couple of occasions when they were at Wrigley Field during the Great Depression. This was circa 1930, Jack. And Al Capone, who was a huge Cub fan, was behind the Cub dugout with his son. And Dad has vivid recollections of that in watching a great ball player named Hack Wilson hit 56 home runs one year and drive in 190 runs. Well, anyway, so as kids, Mom and Dad were so good about taking us on family vacations. And every year, we'd go to a different part of the country, and something that we would invariably do, we went to every National League ballpark. So back in 1974, we're at the Philadelphia Phillies. At that time, Jack, it was the new Veterans Stadium. And so we're at the game, and I get a program as usual, got autographs before the game as usual. And so I get a program and then a Philly yearbook. Well, in the back of this Philadelphia Phillies yearbook is a list of all the scouts that the Phillies had throughout the country. Well, it caught my eye that there were 4 Philly scouts who were from Illinois. So I kind of cataloged that in my mind, but didn't do anything. I was only 13, by the way. And so I was going to be a freshman in high school that fall. And so it's the winter time now. I've turned 14. And so I'm a freshman, as I mentioned. And I'm in study hall one day. And like most of the kids, I wouldn't do any studying in study hall. You're always looking for something else to do. And so anyway, I had brought that Phillies yearbook with me. And a friend of mine named Bob Fuentes, who was sitting behind me, he goes, Pleck, what did you bring here today? And I said, oh, Bob, this was from our trip this summer when we were out in Philadelphia and went to the Philly game. I'm going to write to one of the scouts in here. He goes, no. And I said, why not? So anyway, I took out a piece of notebook paper, and you know, Robbie, with all the fringes on it, because I just tore it out of didn't even take the fringes off. And I started penciling, it wasn't in pen, I started penciling this letter to this George Bradley who lived down by St. Louis on the Illinois side. And I told him that I aspired to hook on with a major league team and that I was wondering if the Phillies had any openings. So anyway, I'm trying to write it as neatly as possible, but time permits just so much. So in between classes, Mary, we had like 4 or 5 minutes. So I went into the office, and there was a really nice gal who worked in the office, young gal named Miss Verplates. And she said, "What brings you in, Tim? I didn't hear your name called to the office today." And I said, "Well, Miss Verplates, I have a favor to ask you. Would you happen to have an envelope?" And she looked at me and said, "Yeah, I can give you one that's our school stationery." And I said, "Great, I'll just cross out all the information on the school and I'll just write in my information in it." And so anyway, she got it for me, and I said, "Oh, Miss Verplates, one more thing. Do you have a stamp that I could have?" And she said, "What are you doing?" And so anyway, she got me a stamp. I addressed it, and I said, "Just one more favor to ask Miss Verplates. Please put this in the outgoing mail this afternoon." So anyway, this is right after the first of the year, 1975. Well, about 10 days later, I get a letter in the mail addressed, it's on Philadelphia Phillies. It has the icon on it, on that letterhead, stationery and envelope. And so I open it up, and wouldn't you know, this Mr. Bradley had written to me. Now, I didn't know it. I didn't realize it at the time. But Mr. Bradley was actually what we call a cross-checker or a supervisor. In other words, he was in charge of the central part of the United States, having all of the Philly scouts who were under him for that part of the country. He wrote back the nicest letter, and I actually brought the original letter today. And if any of you are interested, because it is kind of a riot. Anyway, he didn't realize how young I was. And he said to me, "We don't have anything available right now," but he said, "In case you'd ever like to recommend a ball player to us, feel free to do so." Well, that's all I needed, was hearing that. So anyway, Nan, I took it upon myself to tell everybody I was working for the Phillies now as a bird dog scout. And so that summer, I'm looking at players. Well, there happened to be a guy from my hometown who had recently graduated from high school who threw pretty hard. He was a pitcher. And I have to admit, though, I really didn't know what I was doing. But this guy threw harder than anybody I'd seen, and his ball moved a lot. Okay, his fastball moved a lot. It did different things. It wasn't straight. You can throw, folks, you could throw 90 miles an hour, but if your ball is as straight as an arrow, if it doesn't have any movement, you're not going to do very well. You might be throwing it 90 miles an hour, but that batter's going to hit it out at 180 miles an hour. So anyway, I decided that I was going to recommend this Reuben Otis. So I called that scout, and I hadn't been in touch with him since he wrote that letter in January. So now this is June. And so I called him up because he had his phone number. So I called him collect. And his sister answered, and she said, and the operator said, "I have a collect call from Tim Pletlovich." And of course she said, "Who?" And so I started saying, "I'm doing some work for Mr. Bradley." Well, then at that point, the operator said, "This is no longer a collect call. You're paying for it." And so anyway, so I gave her the information. And then shortly thereafter, a couple days after, Mr. Bradley was back in town, back in Edwardsville, and he called. And my mom picked up the phone, and she said, "You have a call from a Mr. Bradley with the Phillies." And so, I said, "Thank you for the warning." So in the meantime, I'm trying to put on my deepest 14-year-old voice that I can. So I get on, "Hello, Mr. Bradley." And he said, "Tim," he said, I understand that you have a ball player for us." And I said, "I sure do." I sure do. And so anyway, he said, "Well, what I'm going to do," he said, "I'm not going to come up because, as you know, I'm a cross-checker, a supervisor, but I will send one of my subordinates up to take a look at this young man. So, I'm thinking, wow, this is getting exciting. So anyway, the Phillies bring in somebody to look at this Reuben Otis, and, not surprisingly, they weren't impressed. However, what happened, though, down the road? This Reuben Otis did end up getting drafted by the Yankees. And so when that happened, this George Bradley took notice of it. And he thought, my gosh, this guy may have something on the ball. We didn't like that pitcher, but nothing personal against him, but they didn't think he was a prospect. And so he said, he got to thinking, well, maybe I need to do something with this Tim. So anyway, now it's my sophomore year, and I'm 15. And it's one January, cold January day. I'm home from school. The phone rings, and I said, hello? It said, Tim, George Bradley with the Phillies. Oh, yes, Mr. Bradley. And he said, I saw where your gentleman that you were directing us to ended up getting drafted by the Phillies. Joe Bagani was the scout for the Yankees. And he said, I was wondering, would you be interested in doing some part-time scouting for us? I can get you on the payroll. And so I'm getting really excited. And at this point, I just dispensed with my old person speech. And I said, Mr. Bradley, I said, I only have one problem with this. I would love to, but I have a problem. I can't do it. And he said, why not? And I said, I don't have a driver's license. And so anyway, I explained to him that I was only 15. And he said to me, well, let's keep in touch. And he said, anytime you want to recommend any other ball players to us, please feel free to do so. And he said, by the way, do you play baseball? And I said, yeah. I said, I'm a pretty good hitter, and I play center field. I have pretty good wheels. And he said, well, I'll send somebody up when you get older, your senior year in high school, I'll send somebody up to look at you. Well, as it turned out, he didn't send anybody up my senior year in high school. However, I was playing in junior college in the Quad Cities. And so for that team, this Blackhawk College, he did send somebody up that fall to look at me. And then he happened to be in the area a couple weeks after that, and he came to a game. And I'll never forget that this was so touching. He came over to me after the game, because I saw him sitting behind home plate in his lawn chair, because all the scouts back then had lawn chairs and a stopwatch, and that was about it, just a little card to write down all the information. So he starts coming over to our dugout after the game, and I said, hi, Mr. Bradley. Oh, my gosh. And he said, he put his arm around me, and he said, I'm so glad I came today and could see you. I said, really? Really? And he said, and I'm really, really glad that you want to be a baseball scout. And I said, why is that, Mr. Bradley? And he said, because you sure as hell aren't going to make it as a player. And so anyway, so we did keep in touch. I ended up matriculating at Eastern Illinois University, saw some really good players. As a matter of fact, my roommate ended up having a superlative career for the Kansas City Royals. And I'll get into that in a minute too. But anyway, so I'm recommending ball players to Mr. Bradley in the interim, during the rest of high school and then while I'm in college, both at Blackhawk and then down at Eastern Illinois. And he's pretty impressed with some of the people that I'm recommending. And so he said to me, and by that time, folks, he's left the Phillies to accept a position with the Tigers as the Detroit Tigers scouting director. And so he said, Tim, he said, I can't make any guarantees, but he said, I'm getting into a position where, I have a little weight, and if you'd be interested after college, I think I might help you get a baseball job. Okay, so this is what happened. And I don't know if any of you are really, I don't want to get this too esoteric, because I know a lot of you probably don't know a ton about baseball, but some of you might just remember that the chewing gum magnates, the Wrigleys, had owned the Cubs for decades and decades, okay? Well, anyway, what happened, and this was back in 1981, recently, in 1981, or in 77 rather, the old man, Mr. Wrigley, had died. And his family had not set up a very good estate. So the Wrigleys ended up being taxed 2/3 of their $60 million. So they lost $40 million in taxes. Well, so anyway, so that forced the son, Bill Wrigley, to want to go ahead and sell the ball club to generate some more revenue. So anyway, so he sold the Cubs to the Tribune Company in 1981. And what a steal. I think it was like for $18 or $19 million. And today I think the Cubs are worth $4 billion. So that's changed an awful lot just in that 40-year period. Well, anyway, so he ends up selling the Cubs to the Tribune Company. The Tribune Company, in turn, brings in the gentleman. The Philadelphia Phillies had been world champions of baseball the year before. And so what he did, the folks with the Tribune Company, and I can't remember who the top guy was who was in charge of the ball club, but he contacted a man named Dallas Green, who had been the manager of the Phillies in 1980 and in 1981. Super baseball man. And Dallas Green had done a terrific job of rebuilding the Phillies in the many years previous to that, as the scouting director and person in charge of player development. So anyway, the Tribune Company thought, we're going to tap this guy to reconstruct the Cubs because, oh my gosh, the Cubs at that time couldn't beat the Little Sisters of the Poor. They only won 38 games out of over 100 the previous year. And so anyway, so this guy contacts Dallas Green. He cajoles Dallas Green into coming to the Cubs to organize the organization. And what do you do when you take over an organization? It could be a business outside of baseball or it could be in baseball. And you're looking for people. What do you usually do? You bring in some of your friends, okay? So Dallas Green brought in a good friend of his named Gordon Goldsberry to run the farm system and be in charge of the scouting department. The Cubs bring in tons of Philadelphia people. So now Gordon Goldsberry in return is bringing in a lot of the old Philadelphia scouts to work for the Cubs. And so this opens up something for me. So George Bradley calls his good friend Gordon Goldsberry, who's now the scouting director and person in charge of player development, and he said, I think I have somebody for you, Golden, who you might be able to use him in the organization. He's a young guy, he's only 21, but he's been scouting for me for several years. And so anyway, so I get a call from this Gordon Goldsberry, and in the meantime, the Cubs have one of their farm teams now in the Quad Cities, which is only about 20 miles from me. So Gordon said, let's meet, Tim, at one of the Quad City Cub games and we can talk. Well, we had 3 or 4 subsequent visits after that. And he said, I think we can use you. And so anyway, so then that summer, and I'm still only 21, I became the youngest scout on the payroll of a major league team when I signed my first contract with the Cubs. And it was a wonderful experience. The very first person I was telling a few years ago, a great historian from out east who comes to the festival sometimes, Louis Piccone. Okay, Louis Piccone was here, and he heard me doing a baseball program here in conjunction with Lynn Jackson, whom you know. Well, anyway, so in that program, I was telling Louis a story that I was going to tell you now. Have any of you ever heard of Buck O'Neill? Buck O'Neill, yeah. And Buck O'Neill, of course, lived in Kansas City. Buck O'Neill was the very first African-American coach at the major league level in 1962. He was responsible for the Cubs getting Ernie Banks. And so this was really neat. So here we are, fast forward now to 1982. Buck is very old. He's in his 70s at this point. Well, other than Mr. Goldsberry, who'd signed me, I hadn't had a chance to talk to anybody in the Cub organization yet. And so anyway, the phone rings one day. And the voice on the other end says, Tim, this is Buck O'Neill with the Cubs. And oh my gosh, my heart was in my throat. I could barely talk. I was so excited to think that the legendary Buck O'Neil, one of the greatest players of all time in the Negro Leagues, here he was on the other end of the phone welcoming me to the Cubs organization. And he said, Tim, as you know, he said, I have somewhat of a small territory because I'm getting older, but, living here in Kansas City, some of the players that we're going to see might overlap, and so I might be calling you to get a report on somebody. You might want to call me to get a report on somebody, and we can kind of work together on this. And he said, in the meantime, I'm going to send to you a couple of different charts in the mail so that you can see just exactly how we scout players in the Cub organization. And he was explaining how they did this numerically, the different numbers. And if anybody's interested, I brought in some old player reports. After the program, if you'd like, I can show you how we did this, how we graded the players numerically. Well, I was just so excited that Buck had called. So it was just the first of a number of really, really interesting experiences that I was having working in the Cub organization. Another gentleman who was one of my superiors was a gentleman named Vidi Himsel. And I don't know if any of you will remember this, because Jack, this goes way back, but you go way back too. So you might remember this because it goes back to the early 60s. Did you folks know that the Cubs in the early 1960s, the first half of the 1960s, went without a manager for 5 years? And the owner at that time, Mr. Wrigley, said, we're going to try an experiment. We're not going to go with anybody who says my way or the highway. We're going to bring in different coaches who will be called head coaches. And they will be the head coach for a few games, and then they'll trade off and it will be handed to somebody else. And so we'll see how this works. And he said, we definitely don't want to go with just the philosophy of one hard-nosed guy like Leo DeRocher. Well, after this experiment failed, who do you think the Cubs hired then as their next manager? Leo DeRocher, exactly. So anyway, this Vidi Himsel was one of the revolving coaches, head coaches that the Cubs had. Well, he was actually in charge of a lot of the scouts. So it was wonderful getting to know him and hearing some of his interesting stories. It was a great time. I mentioned to you that a dear friend, Kevin Seitzer, who had a wonderful career with the Kansas City Royals back in the 1980s, early 1990s, and then went on and played for teams. And he is still in baseball. He's currently the batting coach for the Seattle Mariners. But anyway, the reason why I wanted to bring up Kevin was considered in college to be what we call a follow-up. He wasn't considered to be a prospect at that point, but he was good enough for the scouts to want to follow. Well, Kevin had a super year his sophomore year. Now, at a 4-year school, at that time, and I don't even know how it works today, one wasn't eligible for the Major League draft until after his junior season. Well, Kevin's junior year was a little off, and so a lot of scouts had soured on him. And his coach had even told, for instance, my old friend George Bradley, who was now the scouting director for the Tigers, had even told George Bradley, said to him, don't bother to come because Kevin's not having a good year. Well, I knew Kevin as a friend, and I didn't think that my friendship was swaying how I felt because I'd seen him play for a long time, and I knew what kind of character Kevin had. He knew how to look somebody in the eye. And he wanted to play more than anything, even if he didn't have the most talent out of everybody out there. So I put him in for the draft with the Cubs. My scouting supervisor came. He didn't like Kevin where I had him ranked in order to be in the draft because we would have them like in a group 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I put him in the group 2, which meant he was going to be a fairly high draft pick. Well, he didn't like that, so they let Kevin go. I knew, though, that he was going to be drafted by somebody. So he ended up being drafted by a scout with the Royals named Art Stewart. He was drafted in the 12th round. Kevin signed every level of the minor leagues where he was. He ended up hitting over 300. His first year, they sent him out as far as they could to Butte, Montana, and he hit 344. Every year after that, he was way over 500, or way over 300. So anyway, so in 1986, he comes up with the Royals. He ends up supplanting George Brett as the Royals' third baseman. So, you know, scouting is an interesting game because it's not always the most talented who make it. There was a guy on Kevin's team in college who was a first-round draft pick of the Athletics, and he signed for $75,000, which in today's money, you know, in scouting and in baseball, that's absolutely nothing. But $75,000, $80,000 in the early 1980s was usually what a first-round pick would get, which, as I say, doesn't seem like much today, but nevertheless, you know, it was back then. Well, he ended up having a cup of coffee with the San Diego Padres, and this guy had all the tools in the world. You talk about a strong arm. The kid was strong as an ox. He could run like a deer. So he had a lot of these, all these natural tools that you look for in a player. You're looking for foot speed. You're looking for arm strength, especially with young kids. When you're looking at old, because you can think, you know, if I sign this kid now, he might develop into a really good hitter. Tim Pletlovich was already a really good hitter, but it didn't work out, even though he had more talent than Kevin, a lot more. So it's just, sometimes it's kind of, and I've heard scouts say, sometimes it's kind of a crapshoot. That's why it's so important to be able to know the character of the person for whom you are looking. And I'll never forget a piece of advice one time that an old scout with the Dodgers named Bill Pleiss said to me. He'd pitched for the Twins and the Dodgers. And he said to me one time, you know, I said, Bill, how do you know what player to sign? And he said, if the kid doesn't look you in the eye, don't sign him. And I thought that was a really interesting comment. One of the other people I met over the years who was a wonderful person, who was part of the first African-American double play combination in Major League Baseball, along with Ernie Banks. His name was Gene Baker. And they both had played in the Negro Leagues with the Kansas City Monarchs prior to coming to the Cubs. Well, Gene ended up having a long Major League career, ended up on one of the Pittsburgh Pirates World Championship teams. He was a teammate of Bill Verdon, whom you'll remember that name because some of you heard Bill speak here in past years. Well, so anyway, this Gene Baker then stayed on in the Pirate organization, was the first African-American to manage a AAA baseball team. And so he ends up becoming a scout for many, many years with the Pirates. And he lived in close proximity to me. We had the same territory. So we were always running into each other at some point. And I remember early on, he gave me an interesting piece of advice too. He said, Tim, don't let anybody sway you. And the reason I say that, folks, is because, and I don't know how it works today. It might be very, very different. I'm very disengaged from baseball for the most part today. But back then, scouting was like a fraternity. No matter what team you were on, you knew the other scouts. And scouts would talk. A lot of times, if you didn't think somebody was a prospect, and a scout from another team might say to you, have you seen so-and-so play? And then you might just shake your head and say, don't bother. You don't have to go. In other words, he's not worth looking at. Other times, if you inquired about a certain player, another scout would say to you, I think you might want to take a look. In other words, you might consider that guy a prospect. So there was a lot of talking that went back and forth between the scouts. Some of the scouts were old. I can remember a guy named Calvin Griffith owned the Minnesota Twins. And Griffith had built a very good organization with the Twins, but he was also a very, very stingy man. And at the time, this was when you could only make a certain amount of money on Social Security, if you remember. The limit was like $6,500. Anyway, I had a chance to go to work for the Twins. And one of my friends said, Tim, you don't want to work for the Twins. And I said, why is that? And he said, because they don't make money. I said, do you realize that each of those scouts for the Twins is over 65 years old? And I said, no, I didn't realize it. And he said, Calvin Griffith does this So he only has to pay them $6,500 a year. So, but anyway, there was an old scout then for the twins named Ellsworth Brown, and he was in his 80s. And so the other scouts would kind of help him along too. So there was a lot of discourse that was going on back and forth amongst all the scouts. As I say, it was like a fraternity. So anyway, this Gene Baker, who had been this great player with the Cubs, part of that first African-American double play combination, who's now scouting for the Pirates, he said to me one time, I just want to say something to you, Tim, about scouting, because you're very young, and he said, you're even a little brash. But he said, don't let anybody influence how you think about a player. He said, there could be 40 scouts at a game. 39 don't think that somebody is a prospect, but you do. And he said, you could be right. And I thought that was pretty good advice. He was saying, in other words, do your own work. Don't be swayed by anybody else. And I guess that's how I felt about Kevin. And I was sorry that the Cubs passed on him. One of the interesting things that happened to me over the years was a player that I signed out of Plymouth, Illinois, which was along the Mississippi River. And this kid had played very little baseball. And it was interesting, though, because he had been a shortstop in high school, and he went to junior college on the Illinois side, and his college coach turned him into a pitcher. Well, this wasn't a super renowned school for baseball where he was going. And so only one other scout knew about him, and that was a guy who had been a pitcher for the Cubs and the old Brooklyn Dodgers named Russ Meyer. And Russ was going to put him in for the draft. Well, we found out at the time that I found out from my boss, because I had turned in player reports on this Larry Whitford, that for a junior college kid, we could actually sign him at any time. We didn't have to wait for the draft. So we sneaked him through the draft before that and just signed him as a free agent. And oh my gosh, that didn't set well with Russ Meyer. He thought he was the only one who was looking at this kid. And he had a terrible first year, folks. Here he is, he's just an 18-year-old kid. I don't think he'd ever been outside of his county in Illinois. And he's sent off to the Appalachian League, and he's playing for the Cubs at Pikeville, Kentucky now. And has a terrible first year because he's homesick. Got to be a pretty good pitcher. And he ended up being traded to the Milwaukee Brewers for a major league catcher. So that was kind of fun. But yeah, just meeting a lot of different people. It's been so interesting over the years. And I really now, and I think about this, like with this Gene Baker, the one who had this super career as a second baseman for the Cubs with Ernie Banks. We'd meet on the road sometimes, and after the draft in the summertime, we'd be assigned. We did three things basically. Still saw some of the Legion teams play, high school teams in Iowa because they had summer baseball, and then we would also be assigned to have tryout camps in our specific areas for what we were called the area scouts. And then we also were given teams, different minor league teams that we had to report on. So on a couple of occasions, Gene Baker and I had the same minor league teams. And so we'd be meeting and staying at the same motels. And in the afternoon before a ball game, I'd just go over to his room or he'd come over to mine. And we'd just talk about old-time baseball. And he had so many great stories to share. And I almost had wished, folks, that I had a tape recorder or I was writing down all of his stories because they were fascinating to me. I don't know if he thought they were that fascinating, but they were just so many, many interesting stories. And maybe that would have taken away from the moment, but it was friendships like that made this such a fun and worthwhile career. I wanted to point out a couple of last things. Baseball scouts don't make very much money. Did you realize that? The ball players make a lot of money, but the baseball scouts don't. And actually, when I got out of baseball, I was making more money as a public school teacher than I was as a baseball scout. And so at the end of my third season, I said to the scout for to my scouting supervisor, this gentleman named Gordon Goldsberry, who had hired me. I went into the office to negotiate a contract for the next season. And I said, Gordon, I said, I'm thrilled that you folks are having me go outside my territory to do more scouting, that things are going well. But I said, I need to be compensated properly. And he's assured me, he said, well, we'll work out something for you for next season. So when the contract came that October, my raise was only for $400. And so anyway, I took it, I bit the pill. And so the year after that was when I signed this Larry Whitford out of Plymouth, Illinois, and they're getting all kinds of good reports on him. And so the Cubs start expanding my territory even more. And so our cross-checker called me one day and he said, Tim, I want you to go such and such. And I said, Mr. Nichols, that's outside my territory though. And he said, that's okay, we're pleased with how you're doing. And I said, no, it's not okay, because Mr. Goldsberry had promised me a significant raise this year, and it was for $400. Well, then I thought when I got off the phone, I just slit my own throat. So I called him back the next morning, and I said, Mr. Goldsberry, I've done some reconsidering, and I'd like to go on that trip for you. And he said, that's okay. He said, we found somebody to do it. He said, we can always find somebody to do it. Well, I got fired at the end of that fourth season. And I had a chance to go to work for another ball club, but the amount of money was the same, so I didn't take it. But everything always works out for the best. I ended up going out to Boston, and I took a job covering the Red Sox for one of the Boston radio stations. I wasn't doing play-by-play, but I was doing pre- and post-game interviews from Fenway Park every night. So, Jack, that was a pretty good gig. I enjoyed that very much. So, as I say, something good always comes out of something. But anyway, yeah, if you have any questions, Karen, how are we doing on time? Probably, yeah, okay. We can do a little question and answer session if anybody has questions. Yeah, yes, sir.
Did you ever cross paths with
Okay, good question. The question was, did I ever come in contact with Hugh Alexander? Now, Hugh Alexander was a longtime scout for the Phillies, and he had one of the keenest minds. I'm so glad you mentioned him. He had one of the keenest minds there was in scouting. And a quick story for you about Hugh Alexander. He must have had Missouri as part of his coverage. Is that right? Okay, so this makes sense. All right. You talked about having an eye for talent. I want you to think about this. One day, Hugh Alexander is driving through rural Missouri, and he spots this young kid. He was a young African-American kid named Jeff Stone. He didn't know his name at the time. He just watched him running like the wind in an open field. I don't know if somebody was chasing this Jeff Stone, but nevertheless, it caught Hugh Alexander's eye. So Hugh Alexander stopped the car. He called over to the kid. The kid ends up being drafted later by the Phillies and makes it to the big leagues. There was such a price, so thank you for mentioning. Hugh had many, many ball players he signed who made it to the big leagues. And ordinarily, maybe about 8%, maybe 10% of the kids that a scout will sign will end up making it to the big leagues. Well, that wasn't the case with Hugh Alexander. He had a disproportionate number of people whom he had signed who ended up making it to the big leagues. So just a tremendous baseball mind. I mentioned about this Jeff Stone's foot speed. When you're looking at a kid, and a lot of times, when we would have our tryout camps, I should back up. First thing we do in the spring, go south. Go to the different tournaments that the college players are in. Then when they come back up north, we see the rest of the college teams in our area. Then after that, we've cleaned up that. Then we move on to the high school kids. Okay, so we have all their names ready for the draft then, which was the first week in June. After the draft, as I mentioned, that's when we have all of our different tryout camps in an area. Now for our tryout camps, folks, ordinarily what we would use them for, we would bring in 16, 17-year-old kids who were still in high school. because we wanted to see them so that we could follow up on them in the future. When you're looking at a high school kid, it's a little different than when you're looking at a seasoned player in college. When you're looking at somebody, and maybe you see him in a Legion game when he's only 16 years old, or you see him at these camps, you're looking at foot speed. That is a primary tool that you're looking at, because you can't teach speed. The other thing is arm strength. I can't tell you how many ball players I saw get drafted, get signed, who made it to the big leagues, who did not have very good bats at all or couldn't hit whatsoever when they were signed. Because the thinking is, you can teach a young guy how to hit. You can't teach him to have a cannon for an arm or the foot speed of a gazelle. So that was so important. So then we would have these, and I just wanted to mention, that's how that Jeff Stone happened to catch the eye of Hugh Alexander. Yeah. Okay, any other questions? Yes?
You mentioned having to travel and being compensated.
Yeah.
Kind of a dry question here, but
No.
you have to take your own automobile?
Okay, that's a very good question. There was no uniform system for all of the different scouts with the different teams. The Dodgers always had company cars for their teams. And the Phillies had company cars for their teams when Dallas Green was in charge of the organization. We did not have company cars. We were using our own. Now, and once again, this goes back to the early 1980s. The way we were compensated, we were reimbursed 22 cents a mile. Okay? Now, some teams were worse. Like the White Sox at that time didn't have company cars either. They only reimbursed their scouts 18 cents a mile. So it just varied from team to team, as did, the food money that we would have each day. Back in the early 1980s, we were given $17 a day for meal money. So that meant eating a lot of Big Macs and Super Fries and, not going into fancy restaurants. Whereas the ball players at that time were receiving about $160 a day meal money. And a lot of the young players, especially the ones who were Latin American guys, they would save their money and then send it back to Latin America to their families. Yeah. So it just depended on. Here's another way that the game has changed. And right now, Major League Baseball is at its premium as far as talent. And it kind of cracks me up when people will say a lot of times, oh, the ball players aren't as good as they used to be. There's a surplus of talent in the big leagues right now, okay? Which is interesting because when baseball was expanding, way back in the 1960s and then in the 1970s, there wasn't as big a pool of talent. So the teams were expanding, the league was expanding, but you weren't able to be compensated, with great ball players. So it's interesting that now that there's no more expansion, there's a greater surplus of talent than ever before. And this is largely because of the internationalization of the game. Specifically, all of the players from Latin America, and now I think 40% of all major league players today are from Latin America. Well, years ago, and the Giants were the first ones to start exploiting this, they signed several players from the Dominican Republic. Well, as you could imagine, not so much with Puerto Rico, because that being a territory of the United States, but with the Dominican, the scouts didn't know how old a lot of these players were a lot of times. And so a lot of times they were much older than what than what the players were telling them. And, just thinking about some players in particular. Minnie Minoso, and some of you might remember Minnie Minoso. Minnie Minoso was from Cuba, wasn't he? The Cuban Comet, played for the White Sox and the Indians. Well, anyway, as far as Minnie Minoso, nobody really knew how old he was. And Orlando Cepeda, who was a great ball player, said that Minnie was born in 1920. Well, there were 4 different birth dates for Minnie Minoso, and they all were much more recent than 1920. So we never knew. The Dodgers had a guy named Vic Davalillo who had played for the Cardinals and the Indians and others. And he was still in the big leagues when he was at least 45 with the Dodgers. So, yeah. But as Ina Slaughter said one time, you sure don't hit with your birth certificate. So that didn't deter, the scouts from signing a lot of these players. That was a great question about Hugh Alexander. Any other questions that you might have? Yes, sir.
When you draft the players, do you have to pay them, or do you wait? Because you said they went to camp after they were drafted. So I'm thinking you might have weeded out.
No. That was when we had our tryout camps. When we had, sir, what he's asking is, how did that work once we drafted a player? See, we drafted them that first week in June. And over the years, it's varied how many players could be drafted. Back in the 1980s, one year, the Blue Jays drafted 78 rounds. Okay? Today, it's pretty much like around 25, 26, 27. Now, when you draft a player then with the intent of being able to sign him. Okay? You don't sign all the players, though, that you draft. So then the ball club starts to negotiate, and the scout is the integral part of that. He's negotiating a contract with that player to sign for the ensuing minor league season. And like that kid that I mentioned out of Plymouth, Illinois, because he wasn't even drafted, he was signed to a $650 a month contract that was only for, folks, the season in which he was playing. So he only made about $1,500 that first summer. That was it. We got him a $1,000 signing bonus. That was it. Okay. So it just depends on. You don't sign all the players you draft. Ideally, you would like to. Karen. Got it. Okay. Folks, any other questions? One last question. Yes, sir.
The signing bonus has always intrigued me.
Yeah.
What exactly is the signing bonus?
Yeah, okay. Well, that's to lure the player into signing. And it's varied over the years. At one time, Major League Baseball, and this went on for about 18 years, they would sign players they called bonus babies. And if you signed a player to a bonus of $4,000 or more, that player had to stay in the big leagues from the time you signed him for the next 2 years. And so that happened a lot of times, that back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, you had a 17 or 18-year-old kid, folks, who was on a big league roster for 2 full seasons. And he might not get a lot of playing time. Tony La Russa, the manager of the Athletics and the Cardinals, was an example of that. He signed a heavy contract out of high school, out of Tampa, Florida, when he was 17 years old. And Charlie Finley, the Kansas City A's owner, the bonus was more than $4,000. So Tony had to stick on the major league roster for a specific amount of time. Yeah. Okay. Folks, I want to thank you so much for coming. I hope this was a decent replacement program for you. I'm so happy that you came out. Please join us next year when Miss Nancy Finley will be here. Her husband will be doing much better, and we'll find all